you know, left you behind. Just to let everybody know, we are on. General public can hear us, so I know you watch what you say. If you don't need to say it, don't say it. But we are out there for people to hear. So, yeah, loud and clear into your mics. And, Rihanna, apologies for absence.
Yes, we have one from Councillor Watson.
Okay. Thank you. Is everybody happy with the minutes of the last meeting?
Yep.
Yes? Okay, brilliant. I haven't got any items of urgent business, and we haven't. Oh, we'll be finished before 10 minutes. Declarations of interest. Has anybody got any? No? Thank you. Right, item 5, local plan update presentation.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Redfield.
You're welcome.
So, as you're aware, I'm Kirsty Paul and I am the local plans manager at the council. I thought it would be just helpful just to do a quick update on kind of where we are at the moment with the local plan in its entirety. So, as you'll be aware, in terms of the plan making process, there are kind of 4 key elements. Element 1 is around kind of preparing that robust evidence base. So, making sure that we've got a thorough and comprehensive understanding of the challenges, the needs, the opportunities for the borough over the next 10, 15, 20 years. There's also a need as well, because the local plan has so many different touch points, to make sure that we're engaging with other council services and strategies to make sure that that emerging plan is able to react and respond to wider council priorities. And the third element is around site selection. So it's looking at how we kind of identify and assess potential development sites and making sure that where growth is happening, it is good growth, that it's going to have a positive impact on existing communities as well as the people that will be moving into those areas. And finally, around kind of stakeholder engagement. So engaging with elected members, statutory stakeholders, businesses, but also local stakeholders as well. So residents, community groups, academy leads, and then also site promoters, and people who are looking to develop sites within the borough. So our next sort of community touch point is going to be in January, when we host our local plan information events. These were originally anticipated to have taken place in November, but there was an issue with booking venues, something we are still struggling with, but hoping to be able to secure enough venues in January to be able to run those. And then following on from that then will be a preferred option consultation in July. So that will be going to full council in July for approval to go out to consultation. And then a year after that will be the Regulation 19 draft, which will be the draft that we will hopefully submit to the Secretary of State as what we believe to be a sound plan. So I wanted to focus in quickly on stakeholder engagement. So we have a very big kind of like timetable, lots of different touch points because of the huge amount of people who are involved in the local plan process and the people that we need to engage with as well. So I've mentioned previously around task force where we are this evening, but we also do a developer forum. We are looking to establish a community panel as well. We've been having regular touch points with Youth Cabinet. And we've also been doing a series of all member briefings to try and make sure that members have got the opportunity to check and challenge emerging assumptions that are going to be feeding into that Regulation 18 draft next summer. In terms of the members' meetings, so far we've done a session with members on placemaking and site selection process, a session on growth and homes and social infrastructure. Some of the slides that we've used at those sessions will be featured this evening as part of this update. And earlier this evening we did a session on transport, and we'll be doing one later this month on jobs and centres. In the summer just gone, we did a series of Your Place, Your Voice community planning days. And these were sort of informal consultation activities where we were trying to kind of piggyback on events that were already taking place. And the main reason for kind of doing that piggybacking was to try and speak to people who wouldn't traditionally have engaged with the local plan process. It's worthwhile mentioning that attendance in some locations was better than others. But for the most part, actually, the people we spoke to were not people who've previously been involved with the local plan. So it was really interesting to hear their perspectives on things like growth and some of the issues and challenges that they think their communities are facing or will be facing in the coming years. So
just come
I
in
did a
on
slide
that.
which,
Just small
yes, of course.
point of the stakeholder engagement. We seem to be doing an awful lot with the youth cabinet, and I can understand to a certain extent that we seem to be doing a lot with the youth cabinet, more than we are with all members' briefings. Just, you know, we're talking about 14, 15, 16-year-olds. Not many 16-year-olds, but we're talking about very young people. And I know they've got an input into it, but we seem to be having I don't know where you have these stakeholder briefings with the youth cabinet, but I just want to know how much time that takes up that could have been put to better use.
So we do, they have, so the youth cabinet meets twice a month. They have their formal session and they have a workshop session. We normally take about 20 to 30 minutes from one of their workshop sessions just to go through a core issue with them. The last time we met, I think we discussed about some of their concerns around safety and perception of safety, specifically around kind of high streets and public areas. And we're just working through kind of what that means for them. And ask them to go away and obviously engage with other people around their schools, but also family members, other people from their community, and feedback. But we tend to kind of pick a very small topic, which becomes a very big topic because, as with everything with the local plan, once you start to pick at it, it becomes bigger. But they're about 30-minute sessions, so they're not particularly long.
Okay.
We do them in the council offices. The member engagement stuff at the moment, we're programmed in until February, and then we're kind of breaking during the PERDA process, and then we'll be re-engaging with a new series of events after the elections. In terms of going back to the summer events then, so these are just headlines that kind of represent that borough-wide sentiment. So a few things that were mentioned was around that sort of disconnect between new development and infrastructure improvements. So there was a lot of concern about that so far they've seen this kind of incremental approach to growth within communities, and it's always been kind of at a level where they haven't seen any infrastructure come alongside it. So you would get, like, say, 190 homes, but if they built 200, they'd have need to have put money towards a new school or something. So there's sort of a lot of distrust about that kind of relationship of growth and infrastructure coming alongside it, and a lot of nervousness about what additional growth pressures might have on existing infrastructure. Specifically, their biggest concern tended to be around health infrastructure, and it was mentioned a few times about how under-doctored we are as an area, and also a lot of concern around kind of those transport and connectivity issues, with recognition of the fact that if you're building in one place, it can affect, like, the next town along or the strategic road network. There was a lot of concern about antisocial behaviour. Specifically, this was more around people using kind of motorbikes or motocross vehicles on roads, vandalising assets such as parks, graffiti and drug taking. I think a lot of people said that they felt that a lot of this could be linked to the fact that there seemed to be a lack of activities or spaces that were targeted at those groups. I attended an event in Chadwell, and there was a lady that was speaking to me there who must have been in her 60s, and she was explaining that her son used to do motocross when he was that age, when he was younger, but it was almost tolerated then because there were sort of spaces that he could do it on that were safely and a bit out of the way. But as those spaces become developed or they've changed in nature or character, it's sort of become more difficult for people to find those kind of informal spaces and opportunities. Supermarkets. A lot of communities have talked about the fact of that the distribution of supermarkets and also a lack of competition. Specific communities that mention this around Averley, Purfleet-on-Thames and also Chadwell. There was a lot of talk in the rural settlements that were concerned about growth and the impact that it might have on the wider character of a settlement. Obviously, as you guys will be aware, there's been a lot of potential development sites that have been submitted around the villages. And I can talk to that in a minute. And I think there's a lot of concern locally about the fact of whether or not too much development would actually then sort of deteriorate that quality and would stop it being a village and having that kind of that innate character that it's got. There was spoken a lot around demand for specific types of housing. So older persons housing came up, but also affordable housing for young couples, families. And there was a lot of conversations around that kind of increased hidden homelessness. So I must have spoken to at least 6 or 7 people who currently have children in their 30s living with them at home. And again, there was one lady in Chadwell specifically that had 2 older children living with her. One had private rented for a short while, but wasn't really able to afford it in the long term. I think they were doing it through a house share and ultimately have had to move back in with their parents. And then there was a lot of concern that we spoke to people around those cuts to bus routes and the potential kind of costs of bus and public transport going forwards. And again, surprisingly, so a lot of these events were free events that are being ran. So the people that we spoke to are not necessarily very affluent. Lots of them didn't have regular access to a car. So actually that sustainable transport, the bus, the walking and the cycling was really, really important to them. And they were concerned about those restrictions on the network and what that might mean for them being able to access the services that they need going forwards. I've then got a series of slides then which talk about specific locations. They'll be shared on the in your notes, I think, and they'll be made on our website. I'm not going to go through those specifically unless anybody's got any comments on. I will just go past them. Yeah, okay. So I'm just gonna go past them, and obviously if there's any sort of questions that anybody's got, feel free to ask them afterwards. But they have been shared as part of the fuller deck. Okay, so then the January events that we're hoping to run, just a quick reminder that these will be local plan community information events. So there'll be a marketplace style event for residents and other local stakeholders to find out a bit more about the plan making process. We're also hoping to have some sort of quick capture consultation at them as well. But again, it'll be more informal in nature, just about reaffirming what those local priorities and concerns are, so we can make sure that they are fully factored in to that Regulation 18 draft consultation that should be going to full council in July. Technical evidence. These are the documents that are due to be published by Christmas. So there's a whole host of evidence that is at its final stages at the moment. Some of them we've already got in our inbox and we have read through, and they just need a couple of final tweaks. Other ones might be a little bit of push whether or not they are going to get done for Christmas, but we're hoping to have everything that's listed before you published on our website before Christmas, or it will be kind of early to mid-January at the latest. I wanted to focus a little bit today speaking around kind of one particular piece of evidence around site selection and looking at kind of our spatial options that we're testing going forwards. This is just a paragraph from the National Planning Policy Framework, which talks about the fact that strategic policy making authorities should have a clear understanding of the land available in their area. So when it's talking about land that's available, this is land that is being actively promoted for development, and that's really, really important when we think about the next point that I'm going to make. And then from that, once we understand what land is available, is being actively promoted, and some of that will be our sites that we're promoting, some of it will be sites by the market, some of it might be us approaching people if there are particular sites that to see whether or not they're interested in marketing it. But once we understand that, then we can start that kind of that assessment of suitability and checking which sites are going to be the most appropriate for development and allocation going forwards.
Kirsty, as you've made something about all the areas, different areas, Averley, Chadwell, whatever. Is this going out to members so they may want to ask questions on this? So if this is going out,
I can circulate the slides when we do the from the member briefing transport one, if that would be helpful, because that email goes out to all members.
Yeah, because I think as you've got specific areas. I mean, my area never gets mentioned, but
It would be
Just
captured
putting it out
within,
there, Kirsty.
It would be captured within Grays, and I know that that's
Well,
going
most of
to
my residents
already.
would say, sorry, they don't live in Grays. So,
I appreciate that.
yeah, and we're a big area too. You know, have 5 schools as well, as we mentioned earlier on. Well, I will have when the new one gets built. But, yeah, it's sort of never mentioned, and it is a lot of green belt as well, you know. But there is a lot of things coming there. But I just felt that people might have some specific questions within their ward.
I would also add as well that if, as elected members, you are aware of anything that hasn't been captured, that should be fully considered through the local plan process. We would really, really welcome your input with that. So if there's anything specifically that you feel is a priority in terms of development or a concern for people, please do feel free to email that across to my team. So again, we can make sure that that's captured as part of that wider stakeholder engagement. And our email address is just localplan@thurrock.gov.uk.
Kirsty, if people have put in a site selection, have put in a bid for, why is it taking so long to get back to those people to let them know whether it's not or for? You know, just to give them something back, because they don't seem to be getting an email back for anything.
In terms of sites that have been put forward through the call for sites process, we do send regular updates, but I do appreciate the fact that since the initial assessment of sites with our housing and land availability assessment, there has been some delays our end, and I suppose that's primarily because we've been trying to establish more around what our needs are going forwards. I'm just going to talk through the site selection process now, but we had done that initial assessment back in, I want to say it was 2018. We have been talking with developers and site promoters since then. But yeah, I do recognise the fact that some people do feel like we've had their sites for a while and we haven't made much traction. But hopefully once we've got the new housing land availability assessment published, again, that's one of the documents that's set for publication before Christmas. That will provide a bit more of a better steer as to kind of what our viewpoint is around site suitability for sites, but not whether or not obviously they'll be allocated within the plan, because that will come later. That comes as part of that Regulation 18 consultation in the summer.
Yeah, I just mean people now, Kirsty, who've put in for a bit of land, have already put in to ask, and nothing's come back. And I understand Mark Bradbury David Johnson's gone, Mark Bradbury is on his own, so he's having to do a lot of work on his own, which I think is probably too much for one person. All the sites, bless you as well. Should be in bed, I think.
That's appreciated. It's a slightly different process when it comes to council assets. As you've mentioned, that still falls under the same directorate as ourselves. That team, I think, at the moment has been struggling with some resourcing challenges. But hopefully, I said Mark is looking at that, and I'm sure people that have responded will be responded to in time. But I can't really comment because it's not my department. Sorry, Councillor Redsill.
It's all right. I just meant that to go back to them with something, say in process or we are looking into it, would be nice than nothing. You know, It doesn't look like we're very good as a council because we're not. It's like us as councillors not replying to residents. They'd be on our back, you know. So I just think to give them something would be good. Something that Lee might want to come in on, but I think they just need notification of something.
Thank you, Chair. As Kirsty said, it's set out on that slide there is the site selection process. So the landowners that have submitted sites for the local plan through that call for sites, they are now in that system, as it were. So that does need to go. Each of those sites need to go through that exercise. And as Kirsty said, those sites will then appear or not appear in that Regulation 18 draft, and then going on to the Regulation 19 draft, which then goes on to hopefully be adopted. So that process has to be informed by the evidence, which was the slide or two behind that. So it's having those studies which then influence the site selection. That's it. Thank you, Kirsty. So it's having that backdrop against the site selection, you can't go through that process until you've got that evidence in place. So that's the sequence that needs to go through. So we have that evidence before Christmas, we go through the site selection process, and then that puts out the range of spatial options in Reg 18. So that's the sequence. But absolutely, if you have submitted a site as a landowner, you may be frustrated because of the time that it takes to go through that process, and I completely accept that. But certainly, we will be keeping those landowners updated as we go through that. Thank you.
Okay, so just going back to the site selection process. So, I mean, there are lots of sub stages within this, but essentially, we've kind of sort of put it into sort of like six key things, which is around that initial sort of site identification, an initial site assessment through the housing land availability assessment, a wider review then of constraints and opportunities following on from that initial suitability assessment. And some of this is done in tandem with each other. We don't have to wait for one thing to finish to start another. A viability and deliverability check, making sure basically that the things that we would like to come forward on a site are actually achievable and somebody is going to build them out. And then that kind of sustainability appraisal of options, so looking at sites and what's being put forward. And then finally, an allocation within the Regulation 18 draft. So just going through the site identification thing. So basically, these are sites that have been previously considered in earlier plan reviews, sites of planning permission, sites on the Brownfield Land Register, sites that have had pre-app discussions, and they could also be sites that are owned by ourselves or have been promoted through a call for sites process. One thing that has changed since we've last spoken to yourselves is we've just started working with a company called Urban Intelligence, who have an automated geospatial site database tool called Placemaker that we will be rolling out within our borough. And essentially what you do with the Placemaker tool is you build in a set of assumptions that you would use for that kind of initial high-level site assessment. And it doesn't just look at our call for sites. It basically takes every land parcel that is available in the borough and is able to run that site suitability assessment on it. And what that means is if there are any pieces of land that haven't been actively promoted that we actually feel might be appropriate or beneficial in terms of being developed for new uses, we could then approach the landowners based on that. It also helps us filter through information really, really quickly. So, for example, we could show sites that are just owned by the council. We could show sites that are just brownfield sites. Or we could show small sites or big sites or sites that are just in the greenbelt or sites in specific wards. So it just gives us a bit more of an opportunity really to kind of do that initial testing in a quicker live atmosphere. So we can focus in on the stuff where we can really add value, which is those secondary bits around kind of that assessment of constraints and opportunities.
On that site identification, could we have some colours on the right hand bit? Because actually, I know Thurrock really well, but there's a lot out there that don't know Thurrock really well. And that map to me, to somebody new in the council, wouldn't know one end from the other. So I know it's in very small print on the bottom, but that doesn't...
Yeah, I've
got good eyesight, Kirsty, but even I can't see that down there.
Yeah, I mean, most of the time these maps are just sort of used for illustrative purposes, but I recognise, yes, that it might be better if we could put some annotation on so people could see where key communities were within that.
Yeah, I mean, if this is out to general public,
yeah,
then
no problem.
Sorry, they wouldn't know what that means at all.
Okay, that's a very fair point.
Not knocking you, just you know me, by now.
No, that's okay. The high-level site suitability and availability assessment is essentially just around kind of those showstopper constraints. So environmental and policy constraints. Oh, yes, of course.
Thank you. Kirsty, I called a meeting today with Matt Kiley, Nev Tung and Mohammed Remshah to discuss the flooding issues we're already having on new builds in Stanley Hope, and particularly the ones we had during the beginning of last year when we had floods coming off the brook. and we have had a very long and interesting discussion about what risk assessments should be done before we even start thinking about building. One of the sites that came up for discussion was Bulven. Basically, Bulven is Bulven's a fen, which is basically like a sponge. So when it rains, it soaks it all up until it can't take any more, and then suddenly the A128 turns into a river. It's I understand that Kirsty Paul, who's doing an awful lot of work on trying to understand and negate these particular flood issues, and she's led by ACOM, is working on...
that's wrong, because I'm Kirsty Paul, so...
Are you?
Yes.
That's you yourself. You're... Now, as we're talking about you, allegedly you're working with ACOM, yeah?
We are working with ACOM, yes, on a strategic flood risk assessment, which is a borough-wide study.
Right, okay then. So if this is the case, aren't we concerned about building extra homes in Bulven?
Councillor Collins, can I just come in on that bit, please? I've just asked we wanted a committee set up, didn't we, for all the flood plains and everything else, and
Haven't got one yet.
we're gonna leave that up to Rhiannon.
We left it that Kirsty was going to email who was interested, and I believe Councillor Redsail came back to confirm that she would want to have a discussion about what that what the task force would be about, and to narrow the issues down, which hasn't happened yet. But Councillor Redsail, I think you were the only person who responded.
Yeah, I think Councillor Collins was the one that brought it up in the first place, I think. So I think you would have replied, I think. No?
I can't remember, but the thing, I don't remember getting any emails. I may have replied and say, yeah, I'd be interested, because I'm still concerned, and it's not just about extra surface flooding that we get from new builds, it's also the waste. I mean, we know now that Anglian water is, when it can't contain any sewage any longer, it's actually pumping raw sewage into clean rivers, and that's got to be addressed as well. So I know it's a bit like micro planning, but I think it's a very important part of planning, which I think doesn't seem to be getting the attention it needs.
Can I suggest then that perhaps at the next task force meeting we asked ACOM to come along and present the various pieces of work that they're undertaking with regards to flood risk? Would that be an agreeable approach going forward? I know.
Yeah, that would be good.
We need that. That's what I thought we'd asked for in the beginning, and that's where I thought we was going, because we can't move on without that, really. I know with planning, water companies never really are clear at planning, and I know that the trouble is there's a lot of good work also, Kirsty, going. I know Matthew Ford has done a lot of good work with, and people don't see it. You know, we've got alongside the new A13, we've got a water like a reservoir, but it's the excess water, isn't it, Lee? That's being done. You probably know more than me, but I think people don't see that, and that's where I think we should have more input into what's going on. You know me, I'll always ask questions anyway. I want to know why it's there and what for. But he's done a lot of work with things like that, hasn't he? Even in my ward, a small water displacement, so the water has to go somewhere. You know, it's got a place to go. So I think that on the A13, if people don't know about it, they'll just see it now, and it will be covered with trees, and nobody will know it's there. So I think we do need that information back. It's I think the floodplains are important, because if we don't watch that water, the water's going to, like Tilbury, water's going to find some other way out. And if we keep building in front of it, the water's a great pressure. It will find another way out and probably flood in the end.
Apologies. I think one of the actions that was given to myself was to contact members, which I did do, and then to do a follow-up meeting. And it was basically to seek a bit of clarity, because the last time we spoke about water, we spoke about a lot of different issues. We talked about water supply management. We talked about flood risk in a general sense. We talked about surface water flooding issues. We talked about the river. We talked about blue infrastructure. So I think it was that follow-up meeting really was for me to kind of establish exactly what the priorities are. I would suggest that it's still helpful to have a conversation about those wider water issues and just work out when you would like things to come to task force. If we prioritise the surface water, the strategic flood risk assessment work that AECOM are leading on, along with their catchments studies of the Mardyke and Tilbury, and we get them to come along to the next task force in January, and then perhaps from there we can pick up what would like to be discussed next, because we have also been having conversations through our infrastructure planning work with water suppliers around wastewater and just trying to kind of better understand the impacts of growth from that sense as well. So there's lots of pieces of work that are happening. I think it was just better understanding what the priority was, but happy to invite AECOM along to the next task force meeting so they can discuss that work stream in a bit more detail with you.
I think that would be brilliant, Kirsty. I think we need that. I mean, I went down to Tilbury near Asda the other day, and it was impassable because the small roundabout that leads to Asda, you couldn't get round. So there were police there, there was everything there, but nobody seems to be taking on board that roundabout is just full of water, whether it's that they're not doing the drains or whether somebody should be taking that on board. But that was impassable the other day, and you'd have had to get a boat round it. That's how deep it was, and I think it's really bad. Councillor Collins, and I'll let Lee come in.
Yeah, because the other important issue is that if we end up building more houses on a floodplain, the insurance company, the houses will be uninsurable, because if they'll be looking at the flood risks. So maybe we should get some input from the insurance companies or underwriters as well. Thank you.
Lee?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just quickly come in. So on this slide and the next two slides, which Kirsty's just about to take through, it starts to explain how the constraints are factored into that site assessment work, and that obviously includes flood risk. So that's built into that work. And I just had a quick look at the work programme for January, and we do have flooding and drainage down as an item for the 30th of January. But as Kirsty said, certainly we'll make sure that our consultants can come along to that meeting as well.
I think it's not Councillor Collins, it isn't just water, it's all the sewerage, and the more people are going to use, they're using more sewerage, they're using more water, so it's the strain. However many houses you put, whether we have all those houses or not is another issue, but it's all that constraints on the water system, and I would like to see water companies come into planning and telling, because I spent 10 years on planning, and I don't think we ever saw one water authority come and give us a take on what was happening,
It was discussed today that our sewage system is close to capacity, so it's an urgent conversation. It's not very well. It's all very well saying, "Oh, we've got drainers going out the houses," but they connect to the sewage system, and we can't. There's something else that's more drastic has got to be done. And I was understanding that there was a new bill. I don't know if it's going to be an act yet, where builders will have to take account of sorting out their own drainage problems, because we're getting close to saturation point with the sewage system. Thank you.
As the advert says on the television, London is dealing with a Victorian piping still. So if you go back Victorian, you're going back sort of 150 years, and we've still got the same piping down there that we had then. So I think we have got to make an issue of flooding. We need a reservoir somewhere, Kirsty, really, I think. I know we've mentioned it before, but I think it should come, within the... I'll let you go on, Kirsty, thank you.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I'm just feeling a bit foggy still, so I just want to try and get through my slides as quickly as I can. So yeah, in terms of the site assessment work, we've got the high-level site suitability and availability assessment. So this is just determining which sites are being actively promoted through the plan-making process. So these are people that have kind of, in the last 2 years or so have made some movement in terms of their sites contacting us. And then those, sorry. Apologies. Looking at the environmental and the policy constraints, so things like potential impacts on landscape, townscape, nature and heritage conservation, physical limitations that might be in play. And this is just a very high level assessment that takes place and normally results in some form of red, amber, green assessment of sites. Now, obviously, Greenbelt is the policy constraint. So any site that is within the Greenbelt would be marked as amber as a result of that. So then we need to kind of think about that sort of second part of work, which is around that reviewing of constraints and opportunities. So it's about looking at how potential constraints can be overcome, because it is unlikely, as I've mentioned previously, that we would have enough green sites within that initial site assessment work. So we need to start looking then at other sites to see if realistically constraints can be overcome. And figuring out, again, which sites would deliver the most in terms of those local and wider priorities around infrastructure delivery, local housing needs, open space and public realm enhancements, or improvements to the highways network. And there's a few kind of different things that we do within that. So there's a piece of work around kind of infrastructure sensitivity testing. So looking at different quantums of growth in different areas and what that impact might be. There's a piece obviously around community engagement. So looking again at those local priorities that communities have got and seeing where we can help fit growth in the context of seeing that more positive transformation of communities. The work around transport modelling, developing concept plans with key stakeholders to say what good growth might look like in particular places. And then also the conversations we're having with developers and site promoters through that local plan planning performance agreement process. So in terms of that review of constraints and opportunities, it's not just looking about our individual sites. We obviously need to look beyond the red line boundaries of what's been put forward. And some of that might even be looking beyond settlement boundaries as we're thinking about that kind of cumulative impact of growth and the fact that a lot of our communities or places within the borough are interrelated in some way. So that might be through shared infrastructure. It could be around kind of transport and movement. So it's really important that we're kind of looking at those broader spatial options and what they might mean in terms of positive and negative impacts on growth. So one thing that we're testing at the moment is looking at kind of 5 very distinctly different spatial options. And the idea is to look at these spatial options because they are materially different and to test them through a different range of studies. So, for example, a sustainability appraisal, looking at it from an infrastructure perspective, that transport and movement, but also around centre hierarchies and catchments. And this analysis will then kind of feed into that better understanding around those constraints and opportunities of individual sites and collections of sites. So the 5 options that we're testing are essentially that focus on locations that are currently the most connected. And this is something that comes clear through a national policy perspective as being one of the things that we should be promoting is more development around those places that have good connectivity in terms of sustainable transport. So they'd have like rail and bus links. Through this option, we're also considering an urban extension at West Horndon, because West Horndon does have a railway station, although obviously it sits just outside of our borough, and low growth in all other areas. The second materially different option that we're testing is around increased development in locations that have direct access to key services and facilities. So these are places that have like secondary schools, they've got a reasonably good range of shops, they might have a medical centre within them. So it's testing a higher growth scenario in those areas as well as the sites that already have, so the settlements that already have good connectivity, with a lower growth in all other areas, including then West Horndon. The third option, because we've had so many sites that have been promoted around the smaller villages, is to look at an option where if we were to just, do an increased development in smaller villages. So what happens if we do a high growth scenario in these areas? And again, it's important to mention the fact that not all of these options might be options that we would necessarily support, but because we've got sites that are being actively promoted, I think it's important that we explore this just so we can test different scenarios and better understand the impact, because the people who are promoting these sites will be potentially opposite us at examination. So if we don't take particular sites through, then we need to have a really kind of robust understanding of why we haven't done that. And that kind of goes for each of these options. And also, again, to point out the fact that there are options within these options, and you might end up with some hybrids of things. These are just because they are materially different. So it'll be high growth in all villages, including villages like Bobbing, an expansion of Southfields and North Stifford, with a medium growth in all other areas and low growth in West Horndon. Then testing an option around new towns. So if we were to develop a new town at West Horndon, and then do some medium and low growth options in other settlements, along with low growth in smaller villages. And finally, new towns at both West Horndon and also a development that's being promoted to the north of Stamford La Hope, which is the other side of the A13, and what that might look like. Now, on the next slide, and apologies because I've just remembered the fact that part of this will be missing, because my picture will be in the corner, but you should have access to this on your printed copies, is just looking at then what that means in terms of individual settlements. So again, just pointing out, these are just based on sites that are available, doesn't reflect any form of suitability assessment. So some of these sites might be wholly unsuitable because there is a flood risk constraint that cannot be overcome. All we're looking at the moment is testing available sites. We've not included any suitability stuff. And again, it's noted the fact that, you know, these numbers might change. This is just based on kind of like a rough estimate by my team at the moment, and that we haven't put any consideration into the phasing and the lead-in times at this point. So although we're testing these numbers still might extend beyond the plan period by the time you factor in kind of enablement works for communities, or if there are, you know, if some of the land is currently going to be occupied by the Lower Thames Crossing, it doesn't come back online till later. So this is just about us trying to get a feel around sort of what different options might relate to or respond to.
I don't understand that at all. If I was looking at that as a member of the public, I wouldn't know what it meant at all. And I don't know about other members sitting on this thing, but I wouldn't know what that means. The numbers and the letters, the places I know, I mean, you've got Grays as Chafford. Well, Chafford is roughly West Thurrock. It isn't really, there's only a little bit of Chafford in Grays, but that's more than likely West Thurrock, that end. But I wouldn't understand all the coloured dots and the whatever. It doesn't mean a thing to me. Sorry, Kirsty.
Okay, that's fine. I mean, it's just trying to sort of communicate it on one slide. That's probably why. I mean, if it was presented as an option for each slide, it would probably be clearer. Apologies for that. Essentially, the coloured dots represent the colours on the previous slide. So where you see that the red dots, that relates to this option 1. So it's what we mean by focusing in on locations that are currently the most connected. The numbers and the types at the side, I probably could have taken off in all fairness because they're more for internal referencing. SPA refers to the spatial planning areas. So we have the borough split into 5 distinct geographies just to help us try and kind of work through that infrastructure planning perspective. The second column, which refers to type, is about looking at the type of developments. So A are settlements that we would consider to be relatively well connected. B are the ones that are well serviced. C's villages, and the option for D is essentially the new town option, where there currently wouldn't be anything at the moment. So you can almost ignore those 2 columns because they're for process points only. And then, like I said, in terms
Sorry,
of
Kirsty, it's lovely to think we can build and make villages bigger, but once you make a village bigger, you lose the community. I think Councillor Pearce lives in a village, or did live in a village of Aveley, which is no longer a village at all. So you've actually lost the community feel that you once had there, And my worry is that if we build places like Alsett and Bourne and Fobbin, we lose the village feel. You know, they are villages because they're villages. And I worry with that. Horndon, I don't know, it borders on Brentwood and Upminster, so it borders on 3 parts as Thurrock as well. But I just worry that we're going to... A new village, yes, I'm all for finding somewhere where we can put a whole new village in, yes, because that makes for good community. But I think we've got to be careful that we don't lose the villages that we've got. Yeah.
I think that's fully appreciated. I mean, the point of this exercise is to highlight really that at the moment we've got sites around Bolton that are being actively promoted by developers that could potentially create another 2,500 dwellings. Now, we can't ignore the fact that those sites are being promoted. So what we want to do is test them through this process to better understand the impacts. And if these are not sites that we end up supporting, we'll have a much more robust evidence for challenging them at examination, because site promoters will be sat opposite us. So we kind of want to better understand what those impacts might be. And it might be the case of, say, none of these numbers are appropriate in some settlements. It might be less than what's even been suggested on a baseline low. But it's just about giving us a feel for what those potential impacts might be, so we can start better refining the options that are in front of us, because there are a lot of different ways that we could cut this cake. And I think we kind of just need to get that better understanding around what different development scenarios might do in terms of infrastructure, but also the kind of the wider stuff around, like you said, placemaking and what that might mean for communities. So it is just about testing at the moment. It isn't about saying that any of these are a preferred option. It's not even about saying any of them are the option. It's about, these are sites that are being promoted at the moment. They are noted as being available sites. We want to kind of better understand what the potential impacts might be if we were to develop certain thresholds within certain communities. And that's about highlighting negatives as well as positives.
Yeah, I know you've got to tick all the boxes, and I do understand that. But if like you said, 2,500, it's going to have a negative effect on the 2 schools that are adjacent, which they haven't got spaces in now, so that they're never going to, you know, unless you... Bourne School, for one, there's no land around it to make it bigger. It's just a small school. Alsett has not really got any land around it to make it bigger. So I think we've got to... The bigger picture is mostly the schools, and they can't sustain. So I think, it's good to see you're actually covering all aspects of it, and I think we're right to question. Well, I hope I'm right to question, because that's what I'm here for. But I think we've got to be careful we don't overdo it, you know, and we don't make the places we can't sustain. We can't sustain doctors now. People can't get an appointment with a doctor at all at the moment. So I think there's loads of stuff that we've got to get out there, you know, that we've got to do. And I understand where you're coming from. You've got to tick all the boxes. And you may say that one site won't be appropriate to put there, you know. So I think it's... Yeah, Councillor Pearce.
Hi, Kirsty. I live in Aveley, and that used to, like Councillor Redsall said, that used to be a lovely little village. It's now expanding and expanding. And a lot of people are saying, I can't stick it in no more, and they're putting the houses up for sale. And, you know, this is happening all the time, all round, actually. But I'm really, really concerned for the people of Aveley, because there's rumours going round, and they said, no, it's not a rumour now, it's definitely going ahead, that there's going to be over 2,000 houses being built at Hall Road and Love Lane area, which is called The Smile. And they're really, really all up in arms about it. I get it from the doorsteps all the time. So that's just Aveley, but obviously there's other areas too.
Yeah, that's appreciated. I mean, obviously at the moment, nothing is confirmed until we have a Regulation 18 draft in front of members with our final list of sites. But all of that land to the south of Averley is being promoted, along with sites to the north near Kennington's as well. And like I say, we do have to consider any bit of land that's being promoted and fully understand what the impact of those sites coming forward might be. And I say we can't just look at it from a site-by-site basis. We need to understand that cumulative impact as well, because there is a relationship that Averley has with Purfleet-on-Thames in terms of accessing services and jobs, but also with South Ockington. So it's about sort of fully considering those sort of like beyond settlement issues as well. So we can't just look at sites, we can't just look at settlements, we also have to look big picture. And this initial piece of work that we're doing is around looking at those bigger picture things so that we can help better understand which locations have the most potential going forward. And like I said, that might not fit neatly in any of those 5 boxes. It might end up being a mix and match. There could be a village where it makes sense to grow it a bit more, and there could be a location which seems very well connected, but actually we shouldn't develop it anymore because we would struggle to be able to get the additional infrastructure to come alongside it. So I think this is just about us trying to better understand the options that are coming forward. And certainly, like I said, these are the people that are going to be opposite us at examination, challenging why their sites haven't been included, or if we've included them in a way that they didn't originally anticipate. For example, less homes than they would have liked, or different types of uses on their site. So it's just about us trying to get a better understanding at this point and being able to progress that review around constraints and opportunities to help aid that final site selection work.
And it's just about doctors and all. We can't get appointments. To see a nurse, I might have to wait about 5 or 6 weeks. You know, so when you take in consideration how many people or houses being built, where the doctors are going to, you know, it's mind-blowing, really.
And that's why we test it from an infrastructure capacity perspective as well. Now, unfortunately, Arup, who was supposed to be presenting the next item, weren't able to make it this evening. But they would have spoken a little bit around the workshops that they've been doing with NHS providers, the University Hospitals Trust, the CCG, trying to kind of better understand some of those issues around healthcare provision, because it isn't just about the fact that we are severely under-doctored. It's being able to access kind of support staff, having the right facilities in the right places. We've had issues where some of the facilities quality of the actual GP facilities is not very good. So actually they're likely to need to be replaced with a newer facility. And then you've got the health hubs, I can't remember what they're called now, sorry, the integrated health and wellbeing centres. I'm not sure if I've got that name right or not. So we have been looking at that, but we need to continue to keep looking at infrastructure throughout, with recognition of the fact that the existing network is already broken and that any additional development will have pressure on that. So it's looking at where we can help facilitate improvements, enhancements or new facilities to help support not just new development but also the existing settlements as well.
What you said, Kirsty, we had a new medical centre opened in Corringham, didn't we? A really good thing that happened in the borough, but nobody mentioned it whatsoever, but they'll mention the bins. You know, you've got an integrated medical centre in Corringham that has happened and it's going to help people, you know, but nobody mentions it. There's no good things coming out of that. And I think, I mean, I've got Thurrock Hospital. Well, it isn't really a hospital anymore, but it's, you know, that needs to, the regeneration of that needs to come a bit quicker. But it's putting those facilities, I think, what Councillor Pearce, and we haven't got, it's all right having the doctor's surgeries there, but we can't get the doctors to come to Thurrock to run them. You know, we've got doctors perhaps in Thurrock, in other areas, who are doing it on teams 230 miles away. you know, and that's the sort of thing we're having to do. You're having to deal with, you know, if we're having to look at all those constraints that you're having to look at. And I think it's, if you can't get the doctors to come to Thurrock, it's no good putting up these medical centres because they're not going to fulfil what people want.
Yeah, it certainly is very challenging, specifically with certain types of infrastructure. And again, one of the main challenges is the fact that we ourselves are not a provider. So we're having to engage with other organisations, some of which probably go through more restructures, you know, than we can kind of account for. I mean, certainly with health, we've struggled with that. But what I would say is we are having lots of conversations with them. We're trying to better understand issues around things, because it isn't just about facilities. It's not just about doctors. There are other things that we need to consider. One thing that's come up is around key worker housing as well, and how we can better support being able to get the right people into roles locally as well. Certainly kind of like newer GPs that have just finished university. But it is something that we are considering. As I say, through this process, we're able to test in a bit more detail, because we're not just looking at settlements. We're looking at that bigger picture, and with what might happen with kind of growth in certain locations around the borough. But then also kind of then relating that back to sites once we've got the results in. I'm just going to move on now, if that's okay with everybody. So the next key part was around viability.
Kirsty, is there a limited, if there's a I don't know, say there's 1,000 houses or 1,200, probably Lee's a bit more into this one, but does it have to be over a certain amount of houses to put something in there, like a doctor's surgery, a community centre, something else in there to get that application on the go? Does it have to be over a certain amount?
Yes, there'll be. Oh, Lee, did you want to come in?
Kirsty?
Oh, I was going to say that there has to be a critical mass in certain communities to be able to facilitate something. So normally through a planning application context, we would look at things like the school place programming work, and we'd look at the number of houses that are being developed, and then provide a population multiplier onto that to give us a guesstimate as to how many children a scheme is likely to generate. But we always, through a development management context, can only ever look at that red line boundary. Through the local plan, we can go beyond that. So we cannot just say about one site, we look at if 3 sites were to come forward. So in some circumstances, an individual site might not represent the need for a new school. But if you had 3 come forward in a community, they would. But actually, you've then got to consider, well, where best placed is that school within that community? Because things like schools, health centres, sporting facilities can have quite a large land take. And that will impact then on the other uses that can be delivered on that site. So again, it's the benefit of being able to do it through a local plan process, is looking much more holistically at growth and how a place develops and changes, rather than just focusing in on that individual site, which is all colleagues in development management through planning applications can do.
Thanks, Kirsty.
So from a viability and deliverability perspective, it's just about taking into consideration land values, development costs, and government guidance is quite clear that people should be able to make a profit, because they wouldn't build it if they couldn't. So what we kind of look at from that is around thinking about how we can make some assumptions around viability. And we are currently consulting with stakeholders from the development industry on a draft viability list of assumptions, and we'll get some feedback from them at the just before Christmas. So that's really, really helpful to kind of better understand what the impacts might be. And then finally, we do a sustainability appraisal, which is where we're looking at the social, environmental and economic effects of a plan from the outset. And in doing so, then that helps make sure that decisions are kind of being made in the right way. And this SA process is integral to kind of that wider plan making process as well. And then finally, we get to like the Regulation 18 draft. So it's important to mention about the fact that when we talk about site allocations, we're not just talking about a red line and then it's a carte blanche, you can do whatever you would like on that site. Actually, allocating a site in the plan gives us much more of an opportunity to be proactive around what our expectations for particular sites are. So we could set out things around sort of specific house typologies that we would like to see on sites. We can set out information around key routes or green or blue infrastructure improvements that we would like to see. And we're also able to kind of look at going again beyond red line boundaries and saying that collections of sites would need to work together on something. So actually, it's in terms of us having more control and influence over new development, it presents us with a really, really good opportunity that we don't currently have at the moment because our existing plan doesn't include any site allocations within it. Then we get to the point there when we're consulting on that Regulation 18 draft. So it doesn't stop at that point. We've then got to obviously consider any responses that we've received and look at kind of material matters within that. We might need to revise some of our assessments, look at some of our assumptions, and then undertake further testing. There could be new sites that are brought to the forefront through that process. People might say, oh, you've not looked at this bit, or there's a piece of land here that I think you should be looking at. And then we can work with our stakeholders to kind of resolve some of those outstanding matters. And then what's really, really important is keeping a record of all the changes, because when we get to the examination process, they're going to want to be able to see what has changed and why between the different consultation drafts. And that was my local plan update finished.
Thanks, Kirsty. Anybody got any questions for Kirsty? Councillor Arnold.
Hi, Kirsty. Good evening. Yeah, I'm not going to dwell on this too much because I think it's sort of fairly old news. No. I think it's probably fairly old news, and I'm probably sort of rehashing things that have been much talked about before, and I don't necessarily relate too much with tonight's presentation. But I've been asked by several residents about the possibility of other refuse and kind of waste facilities on the west side of the borough. I don't know at what stage we are at with that, if there are any considerations. If you live on that side of the borough, it's a fair old round trip if you want to empty your car full of rubbish. So like I say, I've been asked by several people. I mean, I can pick this up afterwards, after the meeting with you more directly if you wish. And also the lorry park thing as well. Obviously it's a big topic on the other side of the borough. Again, I know it's much talked about, so I wouldn't want to drag that out too much tonight. Again, we can maybe pick that up, unless you have any quick thoughts for it tonight. Yeah, and also just curious to know what sort of dialogue you have with neighbouring boroughs with regards if they have a major development on the boundary of Thurrock. You know, how do we engage with those, and how far does that go? You know, because we need to be very mindful of what's actually going on just over the boundary. And I know I've contacted Lee recently about a potential development, which we need to keep our eye on. So yeah, really, if it's too much, we can pick it up again. But just curious if we cover all those bases and what progress we're making. Thank you.
Yeah, so certainly from a waste management perspective, that is something we will be looking at in terms of where growth is going to happen, what the likely waste generated from those places would result in, and then whether or not we would need to do an enhancement of our current kind of waste management facilities. And we'll be discussing with colleagues in our public realm department about that as well. The other point around lorry parking, we've almost got to the point where our economic development needs assessment work has been finalised. That would give us projections going forward in terms of floor space or anticipated floor space in terms of logistics and distribution. And once we have that, we'll be able to really kind of like kick off a piece of work reviewing lorry parking across the borough and what our likely future needs might be. And again, trying to not just say how much we might need, but looking at where it might be best placed in relation to those kind of key employment assets that we've got within the borough. Was there a third point, or was it just lorry parking and waste? Apologies.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, there was. I mean, really, it was more about. I mean, obviously, we talk endlessly about lorry parking on the east of the borough, but it never seems to come up. Well, to my knowledge, I mean, obviously, I'm fairly new to this committee. It never seems to come up. Where the west of the borough can actually benefit from infrastructure like that. So again, if it's too much, we can pick it up afterwards. And the other thing really was the dialogue with neighbouring boroughs. Again,
yes, that was it.
Just to see how far down the road we go with that.
Yeah, apologies. I'm not very well at the moment, so my brain is normally working a lot quicker than what it is this evening. With regards to engagement with neighbouring authorities, the way that we do that at the moment is through something called the duty to cooperate. So we have semi-regular meetings with adjoining local authorities to kind of discuss things that might be coming forward, so either through their plan, but also kind of if there's any kind of big developments that they might be aware of. We also engage in terms of the work with the Association of South Essex Local Authorities, so ASLA, and they have regular meetings, a joint officers group that meets weekly, and sometimes some of those larger schemes come to that as well. So normally we're relatively well in the loop in terms of things. That being said, we do occasionally get things that might slip through that the other authorities might not have appreciated would be of interest to us, but we do have those regular conversations with them to try and likewise and make them aware as well of things that we might have that are happening on their border. Okay, so I think that's it. There's no other comments or questions. I'll draw that item to a close then.
I think you've had enough from us tonight. It can last a lifetime. You had enough from me early on, so you know. But I'm just looking at the climate change. You've got to do this as well, and I know you're not very well, and I do appreciate what you've done tonight in here and in another meeting earlier on. I just wondered if we've got this to read, Kirsty. We can read it. If we've got any questions, we can throw it back to you. If you'd rather us do that, so that you can actually.
If you could, that would be great, because
Yeah.
I am not the expert on climate change.
No, and I think it's Arup, isn't it, that's doing that?
It's Arup is doing that piece of work.
Yeah.
It's a different team to the team that was supposed to be presenting on the infrastructure delivery plan stuff.
Yeah.
But the climate change strategy is due to be completed.
Yeah.
Before Christmas. So I think what would be helpful is if members of the task force could review what's on the slides. If there's anything specifically that doesn't seem right to them, to get in touch with us, that would be great, so we can help influence anything in that strategy.
Okay.
Likewise, with the infrastructure delivery plan item, we're going to ask Arup to come back to the meeting in January. But if there is anything that you notice in terms of the slides for that feels wrong, or anything that you think hasn't been covered in enough detail, if you let us know, then we can feed that back to Arup, and they'll be able to just kind of make that presentation in January a little bit more focused. Because I'm just thinking, if we've also got if the flood risk work is going to there as well, that could end up being quite a long meeting. So it would be helpful to kind of try and focus presentations where we can.
I don't mind how long it is, Kirsty, as long as it gets the work done, you know, and I think we should. I mean, if we read this as members, if we read this and we've got any questions, and if this is going out to members and they've got any questions, perhaps something could go out to them, Kirsty, as well. I think we need, you know, people need to read and ask, you know. Look, she definitely don't look well, does she? No, you should be in bed, love, in bed. I just want to thank you. You know, you've done a lot today, and I want to thank you for I've put some awkward questions to you as well earlier on, and I've probably put enough at the moment. So I think you've done your bit today. So get to bed, have a lemsip, and come back fighting. All right?
Okay, thank you very much. Again, apologies for this evening if I've not been quite with it.
Don't worry. You take care.
Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye, love. You right, Lee? Do you want anything to add? You're all right? Yeah, I know you've been taking notes. Yeah. We've got that's what we're here for, aren't we? To ask questions, what we don't like, and we don't think should always happen, like the flood. We've got to look at that. I'm sorry, that has to be addressed, the flooding issue, because we have got a lot of parts in the borough. My ward won't get ever flooded; it's too high up, so I'm staying up there, where I haven't got to worry. But I do think that there are a lot of parts, and I know Councillor Collins is quite on this, and I think we've got to look at it, because the Thames will still rise.
No, we're sinking.
Well, whatever way we're doing it, it'll, and then Parliament's in trouble, because if the Thames rises.
Sinking since the end of the Ice Age.
But they were saying about Boston today. Boston, they're worried about the water coming into Boston, so because they live along the river the same as we do. So
Boston, Lincolnshire. Boston, Lincolnshire.
no, Boston in America, Massachusetts. Yeah. I don't know. Lincolnshire's floodplain too, isn't it? But actually, Lincolnshire is doing something with which we should be doing. Is with farmers' fields used to have drainage right round the edge, and Lincolnshire have done that with all of their farmers' fields. They've because of the flooding. Yeah, they have done it. We used to do it all the time, but we're not doing it at the moment. So I think that is something we should look at, Lee.
Yeah, that was
Yes.
discussed earlier.
Yes.
This morning, my meeting.
Yes, but I think that we should bring that back in some form or another, because farmers still own those fields, and they should be, especially where they would be, like Balvan, Fobbing, all those areas. I think that we should be getting them to put those, what are they called, the bits that go around the edge, what are they called, Lee?
Ditches.
Right? What are they called?
There was something else.
Ditches.
He said ditches.
Drainage ditches.
Yeah, they're called something else, though, aren't they? They're called something else. I don't know what they're called. I'll find out. I'll find out. So I was quite interested in it, and I thought that.
Not mine.
Well, at least those areas are doing something about it. We are not. We have many farmers who don't dig the ditches anymore. They just let it overgrow, and then the water's got, as you said, got nowhere to go. Find another way round. Right. If Lee hasn't got anything to add to this, and we finish the meeting at 12, 8 to 12, yes?